From Florence, Italy, the city of inspiration for sculptors in ages past and for centuries to come, you're listening to The Sculptor's Funeral.
Hey everyone, thanks for dropping by The Sculptor's Funeral. I'm your host, Jason Arkles, podcasting from the Sculptor's Funeral Studios on the Via Maggio in Florence, Italy, where all the great sculptors are dead, and I don't feel so well myself. So today on the podcast, we're going to talk a little bit about Michelangelo, the most famous sculptor ever to have lived. It's going to be a bit like the Donatello episode in that the topic at hand is just so huge. I'm only going to be able to give an overview to his early life, and then I'm going to delve into a single aspect of his life and work. Now, Michelangelo, of course, is sure to come up in many a podcast down the road. But just as there is so much we know about the guy and so much worth knowing, I'm only going to dish him out in bite-sized chunks rather than try to cram everything in. But at the same time, I'm going to need to take a different tack when talking about Michelangelo than I did with Donatello. In the Donatello episode, if you remember, I mentioned that Donatello these days is not so well known beyond name recognition. His work isn't that well known. And so I gave a list of his achievements in order to justify his enduring fame. But with Michelangelo, I'm going to do exactly the opposite, because I don't need to convince anyone that Michelangelo was great. I don't need to tell you that he painted the Sistine ceiling or sculpted the David. But what I do want to do with this episode is talk about Michelangelo's life and work in the context of the mythologies that have grown up around history's greatest artistic genius. I want to separate the man from the myth, and hopefully demystify him a bit. And what I mean by that, what I mean by demystification is this. Today, it is almost a cultural blasphemy to admit that Michelangelo was anything less than perfect, right? That he was anything but an untouchable genius of a nature almost superhuman. And we are taught this about Michelangelo from the time we're children. Like Leonardo da Vinci, the name Michelangelo is a stand-in for the very idea of genius. I mean, those who don't know and don't care anything about art still know that Michelangelo painted the Sistine Chapel and he carved the David, and they can recognize both artworks at a glance. They may not know what the Sistine Chapel is, or who David was, or why these works were created, or their significance in any way, but they are confident that these two works are works of great genius, because they've been told so all their lives in innumerable ways. Not only in school, but in advertisements, in movies and television. It's part of the basic cultural conversation we share. And to deny the idea that Michelangelo had almost superhuman creative power would be akin to asserting that the earth is flat. And if you don't know nor care about art, well, that's fine. Using Michelangelo as a touchstone when talking about genius is fine. The problem with the myth of the Divine Michelangelo begins when we sculptors want to understand the man himself and the work itself a little more deeply. As a student of sculpture, I heard a lot about Michelangelo in conversations with other students and with teachers in the studio, and at first, the more I heard, the more I thought this notion of untouchable genius was justified. And I think the things which I have heard and continue to hear from others are things repeated in studios and schools everywhere, right? We all hear that Michelangelo worked 20 hours a day. We hear that he didn't use any assistants. He did everything by himself. That he carved his statues without using preparatory models. And that all he needed to do to create a work, to create a great work, was to free the figure he imagined contained within the block of marble by just taking away the extraneous marble surrounding it, right? Well, all these myths and more I've heard for years. Well, everything I just mentioned about how Michelangelo worked is actually untrue. Everything I've mentioned was at some point made up to perpetuate the myth of the Divine Michelangelo. And if we, as sculptors, do not learn to separate the myth from the man, we will never really understand his work. Now, make no mistake, Michelangelo was a sculptor of true greatness, and his works will endure. But by putting him on a pedestal, and by assuming that we, as merely human sculptors, could never approach his divine greatness, we ensure that we never will. So admire Michelangelo, but admire him intelligently. Understand that he was just a man, born with a great deal of talent, but also born in the right time and in the right place. Understand that he had a great deal of assistance and an amazing amount of luck. Understand that despite all his advantages, he still made mistakes. And finally understand the myth of the Divine Michelangelo is as much of a part of his legacy as his sculpture and painting is. And in fact, the myths of Michelangelo might be Michelangelo's most enduring creation, because it was Michelangelo himself that invented many of the legends and stories that add up to the mythology of Michelangelo. He did this through his biographers. Michelangelo was the first artist not to have one but two biographies written about him during his own lifetime. The first account of Michelangelo's life comes from Giorgio Vasari. Vasari was he was kind of the first art historian and first art critic, recording the lives and works of many artists that he knew personally or had secondhand information on. He knew Michelangelo personally and corresponded with him quite a bit. And his book, The Lives of the Most Excellent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects, is a goldmine of information on Renaissance artists. And as I said, Vasari knew Michelangelo personally. They wrote back and forth all the time. The first edition of Vasari's Lives came out in 1550, and it was immediately popular with almost everyone. Everyone, that is, except, of course, Michelangelo. Not for what Vasari's biography said, apparently, but for what it did not say. Vasari, Michelangelo felt, was not laudatory enough, and did not present his own life and work differently enough from the other lives that Vasari wrote about. Vasari's life of Michelangelo certainly sang his praises, but apparently it just wasn't sufficient. Michelangelo, it seems, wanted to be remembered as a transcendent singularity in art, foretold by the stars under which he was born to the task of sculpture, and with little need of any master. Peerless, perfect. And so, Michelangelo commissioned a biography from the writer Ascanio Condivi in 1553, just a few years after the release of Vasari's life. Condivi's work is largely thought to be more or less a dictation directly from Michelangelo. And for just one example of the new and improved version of the life of Michelangelo, it's in Condivi that we learn that Michelangelo's birth was, quote, in the year 1474, under a fateful and happy star, from an excellent and noble mother to Lodovico di Leonardo Buonarroti Simoni, to which son he gave the name Michelagnolo, because, inspired by some influence from above, he wished to suggest that he was something celestial and divine, beyond the use of mortals, as was afterwards seen from the figures of his horoscope, he having had Mercury and Venus in the second house of Jupiter, with happy augury, which showed that from the art of his brain and of his hand there would be seen to issue forth works marvelous and stupendous. Unquote. So here we have the inference of divine encouragement for this young boy to achieve greatness. Very nice, very poetic, yeah, that's fine, you can put that sort of stuff in, why not? But it's also very telling to look at what is not recorded by Michelangelo's biographer. For instance, who taught Michelangelo how to carve marble? Can you believe it? We don't actually know. I mean, it sounds kind of crazy. But Michelangelo omits this information, and we are led to imagine that he had no need to be shown what to do. On the other hand, we do know who taught him how to draw, though naturally we also learn in the biographies that the young Michelangelo bested his drawing master by improving upon his designs, to the astonishment of all, of course. And we also know who taught Michelangelo how to model clay, and that would be the last surviving pupil of Donatello, a man by the name of Bertoldo. But when it comes to marble, all we read in the biographies is how Michelangelo astonished his patron, Lorenzo de' Medici, by carving a marble faun in the Medici garden. Well, who gave him the marble and the tools? Who showed him how? This, apparently, to Michelangelo was not important information. What is important to know, according to his biographers, is that Michelangelo had marble carving literally in his veins, owing to the fact that as a small child, his wet nurse was the wife of a stonecutter. Vasari quotes Michelangelo in a conversation they had, quote, Giorgio, if I have anything of the good in my brain, it has come from my being born in the pure air of your country of Arezzo, even as I also sucked in with my nurse's milk the chisels and hammer with which I make my figures. Right? So both biographies favor these romantic hints of predestination over actual information. Who taught Michelangelo to carve? What difference does it make? He sucked his talents right from his nurse's milk. Now, I'm not going to give a laundry list of all the hyperbole these biographies contain. I just wanted to give everyone a sense of how these bios treat their subject. So even while they are tremendous resources for understanding Michelangelo, they are also pitfalls, and any information taken from them should be corroborated from independent sources. Several Michelangelo sculptors have done exactly this, using documents and letters and correspondence, even receipts and bills, which can quite handily confirm or deny many passages in Michelangelo's mythology. Two modern biographies which do an excellent job of this are William Wallace's Michelangelo, the Artist, the Man, and His Times, and also John T. Spike's Young Michelangelo, The Path to the Sistine. Much of my information comes from these two books. Now that we've had a taste of the mythology and cult worship which arose even before Michelangelo was dead, let's go a bit beyond it and examine the reality of Michelangelo's origins, and see if we can't gain a better understanding of how he developed as an artist in his formative years. I'm only going to talk about the first part of Michelangelo's life. I'm going to focus on his development as an artist. There are hundreds of biographies you can read if you want the full picture of his enduring achievements and a list of all the works he's done. But for this episode, I really want to emphasize his training and the beginning of his career. Because even when you put all the myths and stories aside, it's still a fascinating glimpse into the education of an artist. So, Michelangelo was born on March 6, 1475, in Caprese, a little town in Tuscany, but he moved to Florence with his family when he was just a few months old. His father was from a banking family that had fallen on hard times, and his father worked as a bureaucrat and a notary. Michelangelo's mother was often ill during his childhood and actually died when Michelangelo was 6 years old. During and after her illness, Michelangelo was often sent to live with a stonecutter and his wife in Settignano, which is a small village just outside of Florence. Now, when he got a little older, his interest gravitated towards painters and painting, and though his father wished him to go into business, he allowed Michelangelo to be apprenticed to Domenico Ghirlandaio, one of the best fresco painters in Florence. After only a year, Michelangelo's father had successfully convinced Ghirlandaio to pay Michelangelo a stipend for his work, even though the usual practice was for the family of the apprentice to pay the artist for the apprenticeship. So the fact that Ghirlandaio agreed to this is some proof of the young Michelangelo's talents. So the 14-year-old Michelangelo, he's off to a good start. He's not exactly head and shoulders above the rest just yet. He started his apprenticeship at the age of 13, when it was more usual for apprenticeships to begin at the age of 10 or 11. The first steps towards his future of fame was his selection for inclusion into a very special little group around the age of 15. This group met in the private garden of Lorenzo de' Medici. Now, what exactly was this little garden? It was actually a center of learning and education for those under the protection of the Medici family and interested in the classics. It was an outgrowth of a select group of writers, poets, and scholars and architects that the Medici had nurtured for decades. This select group was known as the Academy, named after the original academy which was founded by Plato in ancient Greece as a center of learning, philosophy, and education. But to understand the goals and achievements of the Medici Academy is really to understand the Renaissance. I may devote an entire episode just to this academy someday, but for now, I'm going to give you the briefest outline I possibly can. Okay, so, Renaissance means rebirth, right? Well, rebirth of what? Rebirth of classical antiquity. As more became known about the classical world through the rediscovery of ancient texts preserved for centuries in monasteries throughout Europe, the more people realized that a few ancient civilizations, like the Greek and the ancient Roman world, had it better than contemporary 14th century society. Philosophy, literature, the arts, Greco-Roman culture in general stood out as a possible model by which to improve the quality of life for an individual or for a state in contemporary Europe. The ball got rolling with this idea back even before Donatello's day, several generations before Michelangelo. Do you remember Donatello's great patron and friend Cosimo de' Medici? He was the first of the Medici family to utilize his great banking wealth to the ends of political control of Florence, but he was also a great lover of art, literature, and learning in general, And along with being Donatello's patron, he also financially supported a lot of scholars who were researching the classical world. Most notable of these would be Marsilio Ficino, who, with Cosimo's backing, translated all extant works of Plato from Greek into Latin, and then shared these translations with other like minds. Things like this were really what spread knowledge about the classical world to the generations of the early Renaissance. But the interest in the classical world didn't just stop at translating some old books. Cosimo Medici organized a sort of informal research institute / supper club called the Academy, named, as I mentioned, for Plato's Academy. But Cosimo's Academy was interested in the revival of the knowledge of classical antiquity, not for its own sake, but for the very practical purpose of formulating a better way of ruling a state, fostering culture and intellect, understanding the world in which they lived, and also understanding aspects of divinity. But all this was taking place in the context of a Christian society, not a pagan one. And this meant there was an impulse, or perhaps maybe a necessity, to reconcile and synthesize Christian theology with classical thought. Now, this actually was not a new idea. In the late years of the Roman Empire, philosophers like Plotinus worked to synthesize Platonic concepts with the work of other philosophers, including early Christian scholars. And today we call this synthesis Neoplatonism. Neoplatonic texts have been available throughout the Middle Ages to scholars, and it was a natural point of departure for Cosimo's colleagues, augmented by the new translations of Plato and other ancient authors. For 3 generations, this Florentine Academy was the radiating center of philosophical discovery and recovery, and the Medici family were the financial support behind it. So, back to the young Michelangelo. Cosimo Medici died before Michelangelo was born, and Cosimo's son Piero ruled for only 5 years before his own death. So in 1469, Piero's son Lorenzo, known now as Lorenzo the Magnificent, came into power when Lorenzo was 20 years old. Lorenzo had had a close affinity to his grandfather, who taught him a love of learning and culture, and he continued his grandfather's patronage of the arts, supporting the likes of Leonardo da Vinci, Botticelli. He continued the academy and support of researchers and philosophers like Ficino, and also Ficino's pupil, Pico della Mirandola, and the poet Polizziano, and many others. And in addition to all this, Lorenzo utilized one of his gardens in Florence as a sort of art school. This garden was filled with ancient sculpture collected by the Medici family, so it was an excellent place for sculptors and draftsmen to train by copying from the antique. In fact, in Florence, it was probably the only place. Now, this wasn't meant as a replacement to the system of apprenticeship in the arts, but rather it was to encourage the best and the brightest of the apprentices towards an approach and an aesthetic in their work enlightened by classical antiquity. Bertoldo Di Giovanni, he was the caretaker of the antiques, and he became the teacher of both painters and sculptors in the garden. Now, his name, Bertoldo, is probably not familiar to many listeners, and he wasn't much in terms of sculptural output. He apparently only modeled and cast in bronze rather than carved marble. But Bertoldo today is remembered as Donatello's last pupil and apprentice, who finished Donatello's posthumous works after the death of Donatello in the 1460s, most notably the bronze pulpit in the Church of San Lorenzo. 25 years later, when he was in his early 50s, Bertoldo finds himself the caretaker of sculpture and tutor in the Medici sculpture garden. And in 1489, when Lorenzo de' Medici asked the painter Ghirlandaio to send him his 2 best pupils to attend this little school in the garden, one of the pupils sent was Michelangelo. This wasn't just a day school, however. This was full-on patronage. Michelangelo lived with the Medici family and became part of his court. He ate dinner with Lorenzo and other great minds of the Florentine Academy. He knew and conversed and was tutored by none other than Ficino, Polizziano, Pico della Mirandola. Now, do you remember when I said that, in addition to immense natural talent, Michelangelo was also very lucky? Well, how's this for luck? I mean, not only was he born at the height of the early Renaissance and living in Florence, which in my book would be plenty lucky, but at the age of 15, he is taken under the wing of one of the richest men in Europe and schooled by the foremost scholars and philosophers in Europe, as well as by a pupil of Donatello himself, set to the task of copying fabulously rare and expensive original antique sculpture. Would Michelangelo be Michelangelo without this amazing fortuitous start? I really doubt it. This isn't to say that anyone could have become what Michelangelo became given the same conditions. After all, he wasn't the only pupil in the Medici garden. He was in the right time and in the right place, but he was also the right person. Hardworking, serious, ambitious, and again, a huge talent, an absolute natural. Now, during this time in the sculpture garden, Michelangelo produced the sort of work you might expect from a hardworking student studying the old masters. His relief, the Madonna of the Stairs, which is a tondo relief, it reveals the extent to which Michelangelo had been studying Donatello, with its rather good attempt to incorporate Donatello-style staccato relief into the work. Another early work, also a relief, is called The Battle of the Centaurs, and it's said to have been suggested as a theme by Polizziano, who related the story of the battle of a tribe of centaurs with a tribe called the Lapiths. Now, this relief shows the influence of Bertoldo's teaching, as it is similar in composition to both a relief by Bertoldo and to a Roman sarcophagus Bertoldo used as a source for his own work. Michelangelo's little relief also highlights the goals behind the Medici garden itself. Here we have a scholar of the classics, Polizziano, who had translated Homer, suggesting a classical Greek theme to Michelangelo, the source of the design coming from a Roman sarcophagus. Now, at the same time, the work is the earliest for Michelangelo that we can look at as an exemplar of his own style. It's his earliest work that he left unfinished. Now, whether or not that was purposeful or due to the Medici family's change in fortunes, it's kind of unclear. But this unfinished aspect in much of Michelangelo's work, it's called Nonfinito, by the way, Nonfinito is a significant component of his enduring popularity. It's because I think that we, the viewer of the unfinished work, are left to fill in the missing pieces of the sculpture. It's left to our imagination to finish the works that Michelangelo started. And this means that we don't just look at Michelangelo's work, we engage with it. Right? The best sculpture always engages the viewer in some way. Nonfinito is one route to this psychological engagement. And we saw a few episodes back how Donatello achieved a similar engagement with his St. George, whose locked gaze outward from the niche in which it stands leads the viewer to imagine the invisible component of the sculpture, which is the dragon he's about to vanquish. But is Michelangelo's Nonfinito intentional? Well, sometimes yes, and sometimes no. The Battle of the Centaurs we can fit squarely into the yes category, right? Michelangelo owned the relief all his life, and he treasured the work as an older man. And his biographer, Condivi, says, quote, "I recall hearing him say that whenever he sees it again, he realizes what a great wrong he committed against nature by not promptly pursuing the art of sculpture, judging by that work how well he could succeed. This work of his can still be seen in his house in Florence." So, not only could Michelangelo have finished the work, The Battle of the Centaurs, at any point during his life, had he wanted to, but he also expresses pleasure and contentment with it, with how it is, as an old man. So it's obviously something he intended to leave unfinished. Now, we can't reach that level of certainty with many of his other unfinished works. Some of his most famous Nonfinito works, like the group of captives and the group of slaves, which can be seen in Florence and in Paris at the Louvre, all those statues were meant to be a part of an enormous tomb for Pope Julius II. But the Pope dies while the tomb is underway, and the family of the Pope had the tomb redesigned several times in the next years, scaling down the scope of the tomb each time. Ultimately, Michelangelo finished the tomb, the centerpiece of which is his Moses, which of course is finished. But the slaves and the captives were left unfinished, in all probability, because they were no longer called for in the tomb's design. The underappreciated sculpture by Michelangelo known as the Genius of Victory, now in the Palazzo Vecchio here in Florence, it was meant for the same tomb, and it is similarly unfinished. Years later, Michelangelo was tasked to create several tombs for the Chapel of the Princes in San Lorenzo, here in Florence. He finished several figures for the tombs, but left 4 unfinished, the reclining figures known as Dawn, Dusk, Day, and Night. Now, these 4 figures were also meant to be finished, but Michelangelo was called to Rome by yet another pope desiring his talents. The 4 unfinished figures lay on the floor of the chapel, just where Michelangelo had left them, until over a decade later, when it started to become apparent that Michelangelo would never return to finish them, they were mounted on the tombs as is. So, to me, it's simultaneously humorous and frustrating when I hear people who don't know the details of these commissions wax poetic about Michelangelo's possible motives for leaving these works unfinished. All sorts of lofty philosophical notions are bandied about, but the simple fact is that things don't always go according to plan. But it's harder to perpetuate the myth of Michelangelo if we are to admit that maybe not everything we have from his hands is completely intentional. Do you know what this situation actually reminds me of? It reminds me, believe it or not, of the disgraced United States President Richard Nixon. Now, bear with me here. You see, Nixon, in an interview after he resigned from office, in order to justify his crimes that he committed while in office, he famously declared that, quote, "If the president does it, then it's not illegal." Now, I think a lot of people hold a similar type of view towards Michelangelo and the idea of genius, that if Michelangelo does it, then it's genius. Unfinished work? Genius, right? Figures of women which look like men with breast implants? Genius. Got the head and hands disproportionately large on the David? Oh, that's must be genius. So naturally, theories have to develop to support this claim of intentionality, right? These theories, however tenuous they may be, linger on to this day. But back to the Nonfinito. Now, where did the teenage Michelangelo get the idea to leave his work unfinished, if it was in fact intentional? It's possible that Michelangelo got the idea of leaving work unfinished from Donatello himself, via Bertoldo. Now, I mentioned that Bertoldo finished Donatello's pulpit in the Church of San Lorenzo after Donatello's death. Well, on that pulpit, there are many unfinished parts in the work, which Bertoldo could have more fully rendered, but chose not to. Now, whether that was out of respect for his master's hand, or whether Bertoldo appreciated the suggestive nature of the unfinished figures, we don't know. But it is possible that Michelangelo took inspiration from the unfinished, yet in some sense complete pulpit figures, and then applied that lesson in his own work. Now, another source for the idea of Nonfinito could have been Polizziano, right? The poet and translator who gave Michelangelo the theme for the relief in the first place. Now, the same year that Michelangelo starts his work in the garden of Lorenzo de' Medici, Polizziano comments in writing about a passage he had read from Pliny the Elder's Natural History, in which Pliny states that the ancient Greek sculptors would sometimes leave parts of their statues unfinished to allude to the idea of the unattainability of perfection. Only the gods are perfect creators, and although we may come close, man's achievements cannot be perfect. So these are the lessons that Michelangelo was learning at the side of the greatest minds of Europe. And although he was not the only student of sculpture in the garden, his classmates included people like Granacci and Baccio di Montelupo and Torrigiano Torrigiani, only Michelangelo seemed to have the intellect capable of applying these lessons fruitfully to sculpture. He absorbed his lessons with an eagerness and a maturity on a whole other level than his classmates. So while the myth that Michelangelo had no real teaching or guidance or even stylistic precedence is untrue, we do see such a strong voice so early in his work, a voice that remains fairly consistent throughout his life. We can forgive those who push the idea a little far and declare his skills and abilities as being present and fully formed from the outset. Having said that, we can look at the Battle of the Centaurs and also see that Michelangelo's sense of composition is wholly derivative at this point, and the individual figures he renders are the sort of stock characters from antiquity you might expect from a young student endeavoring to master the language of the classic nude. There's little sense of the powerful forms bordering on the grotesque which we see in much of Michelangelo's later work. Instead, the relief shows that Michelangelo's abilities and knowledge are a work in progress, and that he is learning lessons from several sources. So the takeaway from the time Michelangelo spent in the Medici court was the influence of the antique, both in terms of the statuary he copied, but also in the form of classic, Christian, and Neoplatonic philosophy, which had influence on his work as a sculptor, painter, and poet throughout his life. We'll hear more about this philosophical component in a moment. This idyllic existence, living and working under the wing of the Medici, didn't last too long. Bertoldo died in 1491, less than 2 years after Michelangelo joined him in the garden. Lorenzo de' Medici died in 1492, which effectively ended the Neoplatonic Academy. Both Pico della Mirandola and Polizziano were poisoned in 1494, possibly on the orders of Lorenzo's son Piero. Piero had no interest in the arts, and likely saw his father's old friends as being allied politically with Piero's perceived enemies, notably the reformist cleric Savonarola. Though Michelangelo was now and then a part of the Medici court for a few more years, there were some of the most idle years of Michelangelo's career. One of the only commissions to come from the House of Medici during those years was for a snowman, after a large blizzard blanketed Florence. But it was also at this time Michelangelo sought to further his education elsewhere. Through his Medici connections, he was given secret access to the town's morgue, based at the church of Santo Spirito. And it was here that Michelangelo performs his famous midnight dissections and anatomical studies, an action that would have earned him severe penalties had it been found out. In gratitude for this access, Michelangelo carved a wooden crucifix for the prior of Santo Spirito, which can still be seen here today. In this crucifix, we can see a young Michelangelo more under the spell of the slender figures of Donatello and other 15th century sculptors than of classical statuary. The simple face of Christ reminds me, actually, of some of the simple little faces carved into the figures of the Centaur relief. At the same time, though, the sculpture itself is an excellent refutation of the idea that Michelangelo's style had a clear and unwavering trajectory from the outset. It's fortunate that Michelangelo had a little time on his hands to figure out how to better himself independently through study. It served him very well just a little later, when in 1494, when the Medici, under the frankly crappy leadership of Piero de' Medici, were expelled from Florence altogether. Michelangelo's powerful allies evaporated. So Michelangelo struck off on his own in search of work, first to Venice, where he found no work, and then to Bologna. Now, in Bologna, he added some final touches to the shrine of St. Dominic, at the Church of St. Dominic, a sculptural monument started a few generations past, but only just now being finished. Michelangelo's contribution are a few small figures, a kneeling angel candlestick, a few saints, nothing at the time that would be seen as remarkable, which, actually makes sense, as part of his job would have been to match the other elements of sculpture already in place on the shrine. The most significant event related to his short stop in Bologna, though, before returning to Florence, was Michelangelo's exposure to the work of Jacopo della Quercia, a sculptor from Donatello's generation. Della Quercia's reliefs on the great door, or Porta Magna, of the Church of St. Dominic, reveal a conception of the human figure that Michelangelo was not exposed to in the closed loop of Florentine sculptural tradition. Unlike the willowy figures of Donatello, Della Quercia's figures have a solidity and monumentality that is created through strong, simple outline and contour. This lesson would serve Michelangelo very well years later when he paints the Sistine Chapel ceiling. By the way, as I mentioned, there is no way I can cover the entire life of Michelangelo in one podcast. There will be several more on Michelangelo to come. But while you are waiting for me to get it all together, you might enjoy a few different books about Michelangelo which do cover his entire life. I've mentioned a few already. And further, I can recommend, for a good overview, the book Michelangelo by George Bull. And if you really want to revel in the mythology of Michelangelo and enjoy historical fiction, you can't do better than, of course, Irving Stone's The Agony and the Ecstasy. And guess what? Both books, along with many others, are available at audible.com as audiobooks. And the best part is that you can get an audiobook for free if you sign up for a 30-day free trial subscription. That's not the best part. The best part is that if you do sign up and get your free audiobook, doing so directly contributes to the support of this podcast. So go to audibletrial.com/sculpt and sign up there. Now make sure you include the /sculpt part of the URL, because that tells Audible that I sent you. And in return, they help out the podcast. So that's audibletrial.com/sculpt and get your free audiobook today. All right, back to the story. So, the political winds having shifted in Florence once again, Michelangelo is now free to return to Florence from Bologna and take his place once again at the court of the Medici, now back in power. So there was a younger cousin of the now dead Lorenzo de' Medici, who was called Lorenzo di Perfrancesco, who had been a student of Neoplatonic humanism alongside Michelangelo, and who befriended Michelangelo, and who now arranged to help Michelangelo earn a little extra money. Now, this is a very interesting little story. You see, Michelangelo had carved a Sleeping Cupid in the most convincing classical style he could muster. Now, whether or not Michelangelo carved the Cupid as an attempt at forgery, or if he was just endeavoring to emulate classic sources, that's a little unclear. In any event, Lorenzo di Perfrancesco de' Medici thought the Sleeping Cupid might be passed off as a genuine antique. The sculpture was aged, probably by burying it or rubbing dirt manure into its surfaces, and then sold to a dealer of antiquities in Rome, who was acting as a middleman in the sale to a cardinal. However, this cardinal soon found out that the work was a fraud. This cardinal, Cardinal Riario, also known as the Cardinal of St. George, was a very, very knowledgeable student of antiquity. He was a humanist himself, a collector, a benefactor of artists, and patron of writers and poets. In fact, he paid to have Leon Battista Alberti's 10 books of architecture published for the first time. And he had his own sculpture garden full of antiquities, much like the Medici did. In fact, the young Cardinal of St. George seems almost to have modeled himself on Lorenzo de' Medici. And instead of getting angry at Michelangelo's forgery, he was actually so impressed by Michelangelo's skills and understanding of the antique that he invited him to Rome so that Michelangelo might carve more statuary for the Cardinal Sculpture Garden. So things are really looking up for our young man Michelangelo. But let's pause right here to consider Michelangelo's actions versus his reputation. All right? The fact that Michelangelo willingly participated in art forgery and fraud is an aspect of his character that you don't hear about very often. We don't hear of it not because people wish to see Michelangelo as upright and moral, but the idea of Michelangelo sculpting anonymous work in a style not his own in order to make a buck, now that rubs up against the popular notion of Michelangelo's impeccable artistic integrity. Who has a higher reputation for artistic integrity than Michelangelo? I mean, isn't Michelangelo the sculptor said to use no assistance when carving and not work from preparatory models, but just carve his ideas directly from his mind into the marble? Is he not the conduit of pure genius, unaffected by the concerns of mere artisans and their need to finish their work to please their clients? He is seen as the paragon of the artist who does not make sacrifices to his artistic vision, is he not? But we see that, at least at a certain point in his life, his artistic integrity had few scruples. And I don't bring this up to bash on him. I mean, he was young, he needed the money. And he was, besides, good enough to almost pull off the feat of having his work judged worthy of the antique. I mean, that counts for a lot. I bring all this up to humanize him a little in the face of this needless reputation as a godhead of integrity. He did what many of us would do in this situation. 21 years old, his benefactor dead, his career at a standstill. I mean, everyone's got to eat. So just a little quick side note on other aspects of his impeccable integrity. We know that he used assistants, right? The assistants' payment receipts survive in various archives, like the Medici archive here in Florence. We also know that he used preparatory models for his statues, not only through anecdotal evidence, but also through models in clay and wax that are still around here in Florence at the Casa Buonarroti, which is kind of the Michelangelo Museum. I don't know why this particular myth, that Michelangelo was a direct carver, persists in the face of concrete evidence, as well as in the face of reason. I mean, why wouldn't Michelangelo use models? If he didn't use models, it certainly would have been noteworthy. I mean, it's certainly noteworthy enough for Michelangelo to brag about it, or for Vasari to record it, as Vasari's Lives of the Artists are full of technical information and procedures practiced by individual artists. Sure, very few models made by Michelangelo survive, but Michelangelo was in the habit of destroying his preparatory work. He burned hundreds of sketches and plans he made for works throughout his life, choosing to keep only the best, the ones that would do him the most credit in the eyes of posterity. And it would be odd if he didn't treat his preparatory models in the same way. His management of his legacy is so effective, it clouds our judgment even today. So anyway, back to Rome. Michelangelo is introduced to some of the richest and most powerful men in the church and in Rome. It must have felt comfortingly familiar to him to have the encouragement from powerful protectors to pursue his career with all his daily needs taken care of. He's immediately put to work on carving a life-size statue for Cardinal Riario's open-air theater, located in his sumptuous garden, which contained many antique statues. Michelangelo carves the sculpture, which is to be a statue of the god Bacchus, in about a year's time. Now, it would seem Michelangelo is back where he should be, but in the end, the Bacchus was a disappointment for all concerned. Cardinal Riario did not accept the statue after it was carved, although he did pay for it, and for decades the Bacchus lingered in the yard of the art dealer Jacopo Galli, where Michelangelo carved it. Eventually, the work suffered damage. A hand was knocked off, its penis was knocked off. Michelangelo was dismissed from the cardinal's service and had to find a new patron. Years later, in his dictated biography by Condivi, Condivi says that Cardinal Riario, quote, has little understanding or enjoyment of sculpture. And even more interestingly, he says, quote, the whole time that Michelangelo stayed with him, which was about a year, he never worked on any commission whatever from the cardinal, unquote. So what the heck happened? The client refuses to take the finished work, and the artist later denies that the commission ever happened, and then trash-talks the client. Condivi's biography says that the Bacchus was actually carved for Jacopo Galli, the dealer who was acting as a middleman between the two, though lots of documentation proves this to be a lie. So why did the cardinal refuse the work? And why did Michelangelo want to pretend like the whole thing never happened? Well, to understand this, we need to look at what the commission of the statue of Bacchus was really all about. Now, most of us know that Bacchus was the Roman god of fertility and wine. Sex and booze, right? The thing is, though, the attributes of the god representing wine and sex, those are only symptoms of a more fundamental cause lying at the heart of the meaning of Bacchus. You see, Bacchus is the god of fertility and wine because he is the god of ecstasy in every form. Right? Bacchus is the god of religious ecstasy, of ritual frenzies, of trances, of any human experience outside the routine of daily life. Right? So this would include drunkenness, yeah, and it would also include sexual ecstasy. But it includes so much more. He is the god of theater. He is the god of chaos and madness. He is the god of the unconventional life. Now, one can understand how such a god might appeal to a person like Cardinal Riario, a rich and powerful and educated man whose experiences and blessings in life in 15th century Italy soared above most others. A statue of the god of theater would be most fitting in his open-air theater, right? Where it would preside over both theatrical performances and, one presumes, other scenes of ecstatic transformation which might take place in the cardinal's garden. And who else better suited to carve it than this Michelangelo, a young sculptor who can carve like the ancients and whose mind was nurtured at the humanist court of the Medici? But what did Michelangelo carve? A clumsy drunk. Go to thesculptorsfuneral.com for an image of the Bacchus, and you can see for yourself. The Bacchus stumbles unsteadily as he gazes rather stupidly at the cup of wine he's holding. To be sure, it's carved in a fine antique style in terms of proportion and handling of the marble, but it's vapid, it's superficial, it's ungraceful. It's almost a mockery of the god if one considers Bacchus's more esoteric nature. With this statue, Michelangelo makes the biggest mistake of his career. Now, in John T. Spike's excellent biography called Young Michelangelo, Spike includes a quote from the 19th century poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, who had this to say about the Bacchus, quote, "The countenance of this figure is the most revolting mistake of the spirit and meaning of Bacchus. It looks drunken, brutal, and narrow-minded, and has the expression of dissoluteness the most revolting. On the other hand, considered merely as a piece of workmanship, it has great merits. The arms are executed in the most perfect and manly beauty. The body is conceived with great energy. The lines which describe the sides and thighs, and the manner in which they mingle with one another, are of the highest order of boldness and beauty. It wants, as a work of art, unity and simplicity. As a representation of the Greek deity, it wants everything." So it's impossible to know, 500 years after the fact, what led Michelangelo to this blunder. I imagine part of it had to be that the cardinal assumed Michelangelo would know what tack to take with the sculpture, and so neglected to direct the work sufficiently at the outset. Part of it may have been that Michelangelo wanted to prove himself as better than the ancients, and then carve a wholly antique-inspired yet unprecedented statue. There certainly is no classical precedent for his Bacchus. Or maybe Michelangelo had just grown cocky in his lifelong good fortune. He had always been the best, and others in power had always treated him as such. Maybe Michelangelo himself became the first worshipper at the altar of Michelangelo's genius. In any event, for a person as serious, hard-working, and intelligent as Michelangelo, he made sure that this mistake would not be repeated. His friend, the art dealer Jacopo Galli, was also undaunted by this setback, as he knew Michelangelo to be a huge talent. So Galli secured for Michelangelo another commission, this time for a funerary monument of an aging French cardinal. But Jacopo Galli wanted to ensure this commission was going to be a success, as did Michelangelo, and so for his part, Michelangelo himself made a trip to Carrara to select the marble right from the quarry, as he had found slim pickings in Rome. Doing so meant waiting 9 months before Michelangelo could begin the sculpture. The sculpture took him a year to carve, and then almost another year just to polish it to a perfection that Michelangelo hadn't achieved before or since. The work is flawless. It's finished, and it's perfect. His agent, Jacopo Galli, to ensure the success of the commission, took it upon himself to write the contract, which clearly lays out what the sculpture would look like months before Michelangelo ever even began. And it is to be a draped figure of the Virgin Mary with the dead figure of Christ in her hands. Less than 2 years after the failure of the Bacchus, Michelangelo produces his celebrated Pieta, widely regarded to be his most beautiful and beloved work, and the only one he ever signed. Now the Pieta gets its name from the Latin phrase imago pietatis, which translates into pitiful image. The idea is that it's an image that evokes an emotional response of pity. Michelangelo's Pieta follows the conventional composition for such works, with a seated Virgin Mary and the dead Christ in her lap, immediately after the crucifixion. 2 things generally strike the attentive viewer of this work. One is that the Virgin Mary, seems quite young, maybe even younger than her dead son. Second is that she is enormous compared to the Christ. Michelangelo had to resolve the problem of placing the body of a grown man into the lap of a woman without the figure of Christ dominating too much. After all, the sculpture is a Pietà. It's about Mary's feelings, not about the dead Christ. Michelangelo solves this by giving Mary's clothing enormous amounts of drapery, which effectively hides her body so it can't really directly be compared to the body of Christ's, while at the same time the drapery provides an adequate base on which to rest the dead body. As for the apparent youth of the Virgin, this choice does not solve any technical issues, but rather reflects, perhaps, Michelangelo's attempt not to lose sight of the intellectual and theological significance of the subject, the way he had with the Bacchus. In Condivi's biography, we find Michelangelo quoted saying, "Don't you know that women who are chaste remain much fresher than those who are not? How much more so a virgin who was never touched by even the slightest lascivious desire which might alter her body. Indeed, I will go further to say that this freshness and flowering of youth, apart from being preserved in her in this natural way, may also conceivably been given divine assistance, in order to prove to the world the virginity and perpetual purity of the mother. This was not necessary with the Son, in fact, rather the contrary, because in order to show that the Son of God truly amassed human form, as he did, and submitted to all that an ordinary man undergoes, except sin, there was no need for the divine to hold back the human, but it was necessary to let it follow its own course and order so that he would show exactly the age he was. Therefore, you should not be surprised, with this in mind, that I made the Holy Virgin, Mother of God, considerably younger in comparison with her Son than her age would ordinarily require, though I left the Son at his own age." Unquote. So with the Pietà, Michelangelo brings the full force of his intellect and education to the task at hand, and really for the first time. The Pietà is no attempt to emulate the ancient Greek and Roman sculptors. It's no Sleeping Cupid, nor is it a bacchus, and it certainly isn't carved in the antique style. The work is entirely his own. What's more, the subject itself is not a classical theme, as almost every sculpture he had made up to that point was, but by applying his understanding of Platonic thought and philosophy to a Christian subject, Michelangelo achieves the outstanding example of Neoplatonic sculpture of the High Renaissance. It would appear, at the age of 24, Michelangelo had learned his lessons and had come into his own. All right, I think that's going to wrap it up for now. Now, obviously, there's a whole lot more to cover with Michelangelo. I didn't even mention the David or the tomb of Pope Julius that much, but we'll get to it all down the road. You'll just have to be patient. So let's have a little listener mail, shall we? A listener named Manish wrote a comment at the podcast website, thesculptorsfuneral.com, after listening to the last episode, which was all about canons of proportion. Now, at one point in the podcast, I brought up the fact that during the 19th century, several artists and thinkers tried to come up with canons of proportion that involved using the golden ratio, also known as the golden mean or phi. Phi, the golden mean, it's an irrational number like pi is, and has various biological, mystical, and religious significances attached to it, and has had that for thousands of years, all the way back to Pythagoras. Likewise, many theories of aesthetics and art making have arisen connecting the golden ratio to ideals of beauty. So it made sense at a certain point that people might want to try to incorporate the golden ratio into an ideal canon of proportion. Anyway, Manish had this to say. Jason, great podcast. A correction on your suggestion that the Nautilus shell has something to do with the golden ratio. This is a myth. In fact, almost all claims about the golden ratio, outside of mathematics, are false or incredibly misleading. And it's cool, Manish also sends a link to a comic and a blog post that comments further about the fallacies surrounding the golden ratio. I have that link to the comic and to the blog post at our Facebook group page, The Sculptor's Funeral, so go there, check it out. It's pretty good. Anyway, thank you, Manish. You are absolutely right. There are tons of myths about the golden ratio, but I wasn't claiming anything more than that people have sought it out and found it in the natural world. Now, whether they were correct in what they found is another thing altogether. Having said that, the golden ratio can plot a mathematical spiral that is similar in pattern to the Nautilus. Is it coincidence? Yeah, probably. It's actually very hard to say definitively that it isn't relevant, but however, there are many instances, such as the arrangement of pine cone seeds on a pine cone, or sunflower seeds in the head of a sunflower, and these arrangements are strictly following the Fibonacci sequence, which is a special number sequence. You can Google it if you don't know what it is. Anyway, the Fibonacci sequence has a ratio, the ratio of consecutive numbers tend towards 1.618, or the golden ratio, right? So it can be found in nature. It's not a law, it's not a constant in nature, but it can be found. But where people really go wrong with the golden ratio is the claim that the golden ratio was used by the Greeks, for instance, to design the Parthenon and other sorts of things. A really good book to read about this, I should mention, is by Mario Livio. It's called The Golden Ratio, The Story of Phi, the World's Most Astonishing Number. Mario Livio does a pretty good job at debunking the myths of the golden ratio, while at the same time providing mathematical support for the remarkable occurrences in nature where we do find it. And by the way, you can get this book as an audiobook at audibletrial.com/sculpt, in case you were wondering. And here's the thing about it, the golden ratio and also ideals in canons of proportion. When Vitruvius and Leonardo fit the human figure into that circle and the square, you know the diagram, what they're really trying to fit is they're trying to fit mankind into the larger puzzle of the universe, right? We all want to know our place in the world. We want to understand how we are related to it, right? This is an instinct that many of us share. There's an instinct we have that makes us want to discover the shape of our own little puzzle piece. And we express this desire, this instinct, through many means. A canon of proportion that declares an ideal based upon mathematics be it simple geometric form like a square and a circle, or the irrational number of phi. These are both expressions of that instinct of trying to fit ourselves into the puzzle. Now, whether the proposed correlation between man and mathematics is factual, that's actually almost beside the point for me. I can appreciate the mystery that it is. I can appreciate that the mystery can never be solved. I also appreciate the search for an answer. And if I or anyone else finds, an answer or a theory that just feels right? And we want to encode that theory into our work, whether it's a canon of proportion or a composition based on phi. Well, do it. It's all just a big piece of the beautiful lie that we call art. So, if you want to compose a statue based on the golden rule and that brings you satisfaction, knock yourself out. If it's worthwhile to you, then it's worthwhile. For me personally, I love to entertain these notions. I think they're fantastic mind exercises, but I think I would be slightly disappointed if I became convinced that I had found a single way to make sculpture that was the way, the one true canon, or, the secret of the golden ratio. Because I find that the downside to the surety of faith in something like that is the elimination of other possibilities. I would rather live unsure of myself within a spectrum of possibility than restrain my imagination to a world of black and white. All right, well, thank you again, Manish, for your comment. And if anyone else wants to make comments and rant and rave, or, whatever you want to do, you can do it at thesculptorsfuneral.com. Thanks again for listening to The Sculptor's Funeral, guys. I'll be back next week.